Welcome to this week's SIIA Tech Chat. I am joined today by David Egts, Chief Technologist for the North American Public Sector at Red Hat. Now, Red Hat, as you know, is a leading provider of open source enterprise IT solutions. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Rihanna.
Now, let's jump right in. Your CEO, Jim Whitehurst, has spoken recently about how innovation requires open collaboration and how the world, not just technology companies, are shifting towards open. Why is open the future?
Yeah, so the way I see it is that if you have groups of people that are working on the same problem independently, no one group can consistently outperform other groups who are collaborating together. I don't care how big your organization is, there are more smart people outside the walls of your organization than on the inside. And, I've also seen too that, we saw the culture of openness really rise to popularity in the software world, right, with open source software, but we're actually seeing it beyond just the software world. So if you look at the hardware world, you have the Open Compute Project where you have Facebook and Microsoft and others. They're open sourcing their data center designs and server designs. On the medicine front, you have researchers that are open sourcing 3D printed prosthetic devices and even collaborating with open data so they could cure diseases faster. And also, if you look at, say, like open government efforts, where you have these high levels of transparency and oversight, where you place the emphasis on government accountability. So the bottom line really is that great ideas are great ideas, no matter where they come from. But the best ideas are the ones that are shared and validated as part of a community that's larger than your own organization.
Now, how does open source allow companies to really differentiate themselves and their offerings in today's market?
Yeah, so we see open source as the engine for innovation at Red Hat. So being a part of a community bigger than yourself, that allows you to fight bigger than your weight class. So if we go way back in our time machine back to 1994, that's when Red Hat Linux first came out. And that was back in the day when it was Red Hat Linux versus Unix and Windows. It's this great big David and Goliath story, right? Where you had these companies Microsoft and all the proprietary Unix companies, they were orders of magnitude bigger than Red Hat. And so how did we do it? So part of that was with open source. So just one quick example with easy math is if we take a look at the Linux kernel. Red Hat has consistently been a top contributor to the Linux kernel, but the reality is we only wrote about 10% of it. There are plenty of other people in the industry that are working on different parts that they're really excited about, but we all work together to make a better offering than if we were working by ourselves. But if we do the math, that if we wrote 10% of the Linux kernel, that means for every dollar of kernel engineering we put in, we would get $10 worth of code back. And compare that to a proprietary company that every dollar of engineering that you put in, you only get $1 of code that comes back. So that's really, it's a 10x multiplier for us that we've seen with our work in the kernel community. The other part, going back more to the differentiation, is that it's not all rosy. It's actually a lot of hard work, right? So the thing that what I really recommend, software companies to do is really focus on the things that your customers value. We are the enterprise open source company, and we are narrowly focused on that. We're not making cell phones. We're not making, trying to be all things, set-top boxes, all this stuff. Linux is in all over the place and all of those things, but we're making the conscious effort to focus on the enterprise software business, and that's our core. So we're not diluting ourselves. And then the second thing is that, like I was saying, open source, it's not easy, right? Because when you're creating this culture of transparency, you're forcing accountability and responsibility on yourself. You can't hide behind a binary. You have to be vigilant all the time. And that also means that the good and bad news with open source, if that's the way you're running your business, is that you always have to be delivering value or you risk being replaced. So that for us, that creates a financial incentive for us to do our best all the time, always be open, always be first. And that's a lot of hard work, right? Which is very different from the proprietary companies that they could lock customers in and they could sit back on vendor lock-in, but that puts them at risk of being complacent. And I've seen too, like when I go and I talk with customers, they see Red Hat as the good guys. because we're always out there delivering value. And because if we don't, we're out of there. And as opposed to like other vendors, I talk to customers, and there's just such animosity between the customer and company relationship. It's actually pretty toxic because they're locked in. And there's no way out, and they see us as that open alternative that could free them up to do other things.
Great. You touched a little bit on open government, and Red Hat's footprint in the federal government market has expanded greatly over recent years. Open source is obviously a big part of that. Can you discuss Red Hat's success in this area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it'll be in February of 2017 will be 10 years for me at Red Hat. So it's been a great journey of seeing this growth and seeing us take off. We've helped a lot of our public sector customers move from proprietary vendor lock-in to open. That goes back to the Unix days back in 1994 when you would have the Unix operating system only came from a particular hardware vendor, and the switching cost from one Unix vendor to another one, it was just very cost prohibitive. And so Linux comes on the scene, and Red Hat Linux and our enterprise offering that came after that created this abstraction layer. And then what that does is it provides customers with choice. So it creates this abstraction layer that lets everything above it and everything below it to be different. And so by having people standardize on Red Hat's Linux, they could have vendor choice. And so instead of being locked into one particular hardware vendor, they could go with Dell today, and they get mad at Dell, they could switch over to HP, and all of a sudden they get mad at HP, they could switch back over to Dell, and they could pit the hardware vendors against each other to again deliver value with those abstraction layers. And so Red Hat's business model is that our goal is to be Switzerland, right? Where if we've done that with Linux, where everything above it and below it could be different, but we're starting to do that up and down the stack. So beyond Linux, we're doing that with our enterprise middleware and with our cloud technologies and software-defined storage and management technologies. Is that people can standardize on any point of the stack that they want, and everything above it and everything below it can be different. And I think tying this back to the federal government, there's been a lot of mandates for things like cloud first, where these agencies are being told you got to be moving to the cloud. And the same way that our customers have been successful of going from one hardware vendor to another hardware vendor because they standardized on open source, now instead of choosing between hardware vendors, they can also pick different cloud vendors on top of that too, because they standardized on an open source layer that we've provided for them.
So thinking about those cloud vendors that you're talking about, some will tell you that the federal government market is one of the hardest to be successful in and the hardest to penetrate. So what advice would you give companies who are trying to penetrate the market?
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, especially for the smaller companies where it's just how do you get started, because the procurement, how do you do procurement and all that is very Byzantine, and and it's really hard to do, and you got to make this big upfront investment a lot of times to get started. But I'll give you some advice in two different ways. One is from a sales standpoint, where number one is that my recommendation is to find great channel partners that have the contract vehicles for the customers that you're targeting already. So, that's what they do for a living. They own those contracts, and by working with them, the barrier to acquisition is a lot lower than you trying to do some sort of exception or you trying to manage those contract vehicles yourself, especially if you're a small company and you don't have the resources to do that for all the different contract vehicles that are out there. And then the second is from a technology standpoint. And I would break that into a couple different things. So one is that you really want to understand the federal government's IT pain points, which is very different from the commercial sector as well. So in October, IDC came out with a study that talked about technical debt. And they said that the federal government spends 77.7% of their agency budgets on average on operations and maintenance. So 3 out of every $4 is spent on keeping the lights on, and 1 out of every $4 is being spent on just innovation. So that's actually up from 2008, which was only 66%. So as you have these increasing security requirements and complexities, it's really harder and harder to do any sort of innovation at all. The second problem that you have is this retiring workforce, where I've seen where more than 50% of a lot of agency IT workers are looking at retiring in the next 5 years. And so how do you replace them? And then you look at the hiring that you have where, well, okay, I'm going to hire somebody out of college. A lot of times Google and a lot of private industry is going to pay a lot more than a federal employee is able, what they're able to pay. So that becomes a problem too. And so what we could do, though, is that if you start looking from a software standpoint of how can you improve upon that um, and address those pain points, looking at things like platform as a service and software as a service could really help. So you make things easier. You could address things like technical debt, where they can give the SaaS or PaaS provider the money, and then they can work. The provider can focus on paying the staff, and they could possibly afford the private sector pay rates that they can't afford in the public sector. And then so that's one part. The second part from a technology standpoint is understanding the government standards and take security seriously. Especially a lot of times with startups is that you have a limited amount of venture capital that you're burning through and limited runway, right? But if you're not taking security seriously and accreditation seriously, getting the authority to operate inside the government is going to be really, really difficult. So building, a lot of companies are building on top of open source. We recommend using commercially supported open source like Red Hat products, where we've already gone through all the certifications like FIPS and common criteria. So you have the certified foundation that you could build your application on top of. And people have already standardized on that as well. So again, it's like if in the federal government where people have standardized on that, your application could be the thing that's different, but then we could deploy it on any type of hardware target that they want. And the last thing that I want to hit on too is customer references, which I think is another big challenge that we face at Red Hat. And that's, I think, a problem at large for a lot of software and hardware vendors where the government agencies they don't want to look like they're doing product endorsements at all because it's not legal for them to do. But because even if it's a customer reference, even if it has a perception of looking like a product endorsement, they're going to say no. But the way I look at it is a way to address that is to try to make your customers as successful as possible as soon as possible. And by doing that, the more successful you can make your customers, the more willing they would be to share their story. And the way you do that is you understand their business, you get them into production quickly, you help them with the security accreditations, and you also help them make a difference in the agencies, and you make them heroes. And they're much more likely to tell the good news about how that the government is a better place because of the technology that you're bringing to bear.
David, thank you so much for your time and insights today. For more information on Red Hat and SIIA, please visit our websites and stay tuned for next week's Tech Chats. Thank you.